Hey guys, Navanata on No Limit Hold'em. This is the fourth video of the Overpowered Poker series, and this is the first one on flop play. So in this video, we're going to be addressing flop play on the flop, as pre-flop raiser in a single raised heads-up pot. So either we had an open limper and we isolated, or we open raised and got called by one of the blinds, but we're going to the flop in position against one player. So what can we say about our range compared to our opponent's range? Because this is obviously very important. Well, there's a few things that can be said when we compare pre-flop raiser's range to pre-flop caller's range. So as pre-flop raiser, our range will be less bounded because we can have like light opens and kind of bluffs, semi-bluffy type hands. And it's going to be uncapped because we can have pocket aces. That's the main difference between pre-flop raiser's range and pre-flop caller's range. Is pre-flop raiser is going to be uncapped, not as bound, and a little bit wider, where pre-flop caller's range is going to be capped because he would have 3-bet like aces and kings, assuming, well, at least he's not representing that he has aces and kings when he just flat calls. So the range that he's repping is capped, it's bounded, and it's going to have a lot of middle strength hands. It's going to be more narrow and well defined. It's going to hit more specific flops in more specific ways. And it's going to have more bluff catchers and less air. It won't be as wide as ours, but that's going to have some specific consequences. And the specific consequences, like the dynamic of having a wide, uncapped, less bound range against a more narrowly defined, tighter, slightly on average stronger range, but one that has less really strong hands and not as weak a hands, is going to be exactly the default check to the pre-flop raiser and default bet as pre-flop raiser dynamic that you see in games at every stake with all kinds of players, and what I'm talking about continuation betting, obviously. Like it's this wide, uncapped range compared to a bluff catcher heavy, like middle strength range that gives rise to this default check to raiser and default bet as pre-flop raiser dynamic of continuation betting. Because if as pre-flop raiser, we're always going to be able to represent at least an overpair, unless there's an ace on the board, in which case we can rep top set. So we're always going to have some incentive to bet because we'll always have some value hands, and we're also going to have more air because our range is wider. So if villain's going to have a lot of middle strength hands, some hands that are just going to check and fold, and some hands that are going to make some draws, and some like middle strength broadways and things that are going to make like top pair with a mediocre kicker, second pair with a decent kicker, and we're gonna like miss completely and have like top pair top kickers and over pairs. Then on most flops, the incentive to aggress is gonna go towards pre-flop raiser and away from pre-flop caller. It's not some magical thing called an initiative that just makes our bets better or something. It's just something about the equity distributions. Pre-flop caller will have more hands that just have more incentive to check, and pre-flop raiser will have more bluffs and more value bets, so he'll have more incentive to bet on most flops. That's what the whole continuation bet thing really means, or at least that's why it has stood the test of time. You just have more incentive to aggress if you're aggressive pre-flop because your range is not capped and it's less bounded. So when we see the flop, that's going to normally be the case, but the very first thing we should do is just make sure it's the case. On most boards, we're going to have a nut advantage and a frequent strength advantage, but we're going to have more air. And all of that leads to us, as pre-flop raiser, having more incentive to be aggressive, and so that's why we should be c-betting a pretty high percent of flops. But the first thing we should do is we should identify and see if this is one of the cases where either because of the hand we have or because of the range disadvantage we're at, maybe we shouldn't be betting. So step one is, let's determine whether we have a range advantage or a range disadvantage. And that shows up in two main ways. It's one range advantage is the frequent strength advantage, which is something like just having less air balls in your range, and more like top pairs and second pairs. The other way that the range advantage can manifest is with a nut advantage. Like if you're under the gun in a full ring game and you open raise and get called by the button and you're fairly deep, say, but you're just deep against the button. Let's say that this is a really good example, I think. So let's say you're 60 big blinds deep against all these fish, except for one player who's on the button you're 200 or 300 big blinds deep with. You open raise from under the gun, and you get called by the button, and the flop comes ace king queen. So like if your villain here, the button has jack 10 suited and you don't, then he has the nut advantage, but you have all of the sets in your range and he has none of them. So you have the frequent strength advantage. And what's more important? Well, it depends on how deep you are. And really that's not something I want to get into right now. But this is the first thing we should look at is, do we have nut advantage or does our opponent? And who has less air, who has more frequent strengths, who hits the board hardest and most often. The player that hits the board hardest and most often has the most incentive to be aggressive because they're going to have the value range, and if you're going to have a good value range and you're going to have hands that have incentive to bet for value on 3 streets, then you're also going to need to have bluffs. So the very first thing again is who has the nut advantage and who has the frequent strength advantage. Then once we know if we're playing offense or defense, because the player that has the range advantage can be thought of as being on offense, while the player that's at a range disadvantage is playing something like defense. So once we have that figured out, we need to frame our hand out and try to figure out what the relative hand value is of this exact hand that we're holding right here, right now. So step one, who has the range advantage? That's it. Am I on offense or am I on defense? Step two is something like using that information, like who has range advantage and what kind of hands do I get here with, what kind of hands does my opponent get here with, and what does that mean about my aggression range? So what kind of aggression, if I'm going to have an aggression range at all, which you usually will, what's it going to look like? Is it going to be a linear range? Am I just going to bet my entire range, for instance? Or is my range going to be polarized, where I'm going to be betting some very strong hands for value, some bluffs for balance, and checking the rest of my middle strength hands back? Like if you have a massive range advantage and you just want to bet your entire range, then that's fine. If you're not going to do that because you don't have a massive range advantage, then you're going to want to polarize your range. And if you're going to want to polarize your range, then you need to have some hands that are betting for value, some hands that are bluffing, and then some hands that are checking back. So once you've decided that, you have to just kind of frame your hand out. And it can also be the case that you are at such a range disadvantage that you don't have any bets. Like you might not want an aggro range at all. But step three is just frame your hand. Just framing your hand based on relative hand value and your opponent's mistake propensities, and you're just gonna look at the board, think of your range, think of your opponent's range, and plan your line. Think about how many bets you would like to get into this pot and what the best way for them to go into the pot is based on how strong your hand is relative to your range and your opponent's, and what you know about your opponent, and maybe even whatever he may think he knows about you. So like your image and his image, his range, your perceived range, and your actual hand value. Then you're going to plan your line out. So that's step three. And step four is execute. So once you've decided how you're going to deal with most runouts with the hand you have, with the range you have and the hand you have, then you should either check out your option or work out a bet size based on the stack to pot ratio, pot geometry, your, again, hand value, the texture, equity distributions, and what does my betting range look like? Is it going to be polar or linear? Do I want to just bet everything and wait till the next street to split my range? And if so, what does that mean about the way I'm going to size my bets? we're not going to get into this in like huge detail right now. There's just too much to introduce in this first video on post-flop play. Um, but just kind of as an example, the line that we take is going to depend in a lot of ways on whether we're playing a volatile dynamic board or if our board is very static and dry. Because if the board's very static and we're like way ahead or way behind, then we're probably going to be able to plan our entire line out unless something very strange happens just on the flop. So if we're planning our line out on the flop, then we just have to think, how many streets do I want to bet, if any? And if I'm going to bet 2 streets, for instance, do I want to start with this one? Or does this hand play better as a check back and then start betting on turn if I get checked to again, or bluff catching if I get bet into? So we can start planning the entire rest of the hand, assuming we don't get raised, or villain doesn't donk into us, or no very strange runouts come. We should be able to do that on the flop when we're way ahead or way behind, because the board is very static, not very wet, pretty dry. But if the board is very volatile and dynamic, we really can't make a plan for the entire hand, or most players can. But we should still try to think a little bit ahead. Like, think about what things are going to make a difference. So, like, maybe a good way to think of it would be something like, make a plan for this street, the next street, and, you know, like a most likely thing that's going to happen on all 3 streets. But be open and don't overcommit. You know, think ahead, but don't commit yourself to doing something kind of no matter what. The first thing we're going to think of as soon as the flop comes out is who's got the range advantage. So who's playing offense and who's playing defense. Then we're going to frame our hand based on relative hand value and opponent mistake propensity. And like, we can think of this as we're always going to have one of 3 hands. We're either going to have value, bluff catcher, or bluff. Or we can get a little bit more specific, see Navinat's line. And we can say, like, and we're going to cover this in future videos, but well, in this, in probably the next video, we're going to get into this part. We can think just like value, bluff, or showdown value. Or we can take it a little more specific and frame out a little bit more than that, and look at it like, do I have a nut value hand, a value hand, a bluff catcher, a showdown value? Do I have a draw, or do I have error? So I'm always playing one of those maybe 5 hand types against one of basically 3 opponents for all intents and purposes. My opponent's either going to be the type of player who makes a lot of calling mistakes, who makes a lot of aggressive mistakes, or who's making a lot of folding mistakes. Like, he's either going to be a nit, a station, or a maniac, or for all intents, he's going to. Or if he's an unknown player, then I'm going to just try to stay something like balanced. So we're going to frame our hand based on our relative hand value and opponent mistake propensity. We're going to think the hand out and try to plan out a line based on all the information that we have. And if our hand fits into the line as a bet, then we're going to have to size our bet, try to figure out the right kind of sizing for the bet. Continuation betting is very important. We're going to think mostly about getting value from worse hands and getting better hands to fold. Like, mostly that's why we see that. And then also know when you should be balanced and when you should be playing a more exploitative approach. So like, when your opponent's really not great at poker, maybe balance doesn't mean that much. If you specifically know that your opponent makes a lot of calling mistakes, then you shouldn't be bluffing. You should be value betting thin, bluffing less often, if at all. If your opponent is very nitty and tight, then you can't value bet very thin, but you can bluff, and you can turn some of your what would be check back range into bluffs against exactly that kind of player. So you need to know when you can be balanced and when you can play exploitative. And if you can play more exploitatively, then what do you know about your opponent that would make you want to change your default strategy because you think it'll make more money? Really practicing this and always going into the flop thinking in these terms: am I playing offense or defense? Frame my hand out, relative hand value, opponent mistake propensity, and then if my hand is going to be an aggression action here, if I'm going to be taking a bet option on this, like at this decision point, then what kind of what kind of sizing is going to make sense based on whatever factors we want to draw in. So this is going to be kind of the form that we want to use when we're thinking out our hands on the flop. And so that's really what I wanted to get into in this video. And then part 2 and part 3 are going to flesh these ideas out a little bit more. Yeah, for now, I think that's going to do it. So Navinat on No Limit Hold'em, OP Poker, OP Poker. Till next time, guys. Navinat on No Limit Hold'em. Good quote, Luck, end quote.